Okay, so the theme of my talk is the distractions of abstraction. I was thinking about the differences between working as an abstract photographer and working perhaps if we take landscape photography. I'm assuming I've made some sort of assumptions about you as an audience, and probably some of those assumptions will be wrong, but I've had to sort of limit the scope of the talk a little bit. I'm assuming that the vast majority of you are primarily interested in landscape photography, and there's probably some of you as well that are interested in abstract photography. So that's sort of how I'm going to couch the talk, but I'm sure some of you have got other interests as well, but just to put some boundaries on it. And I was thinking about how abstract photographers and landscape photographers have a different approach maybe when they walk into, say, a landscape to start making their images. Because as somebody who teaches photography, I see a lot of photographers jumping out of the minibus and walking down onto the beach or onto the moorland or whatever. And you see two different approaches, those that are landscapers, primarily those that are abstract photographers. And the landscape photographers have this heroic sort of approach as they stride off with their tripods into the landscape. Their eyes are on the horizon, they look up at the sky, and they see the clouds, and they're looking at shapes in the clouds. You can see them looking for the beautiful tree shapes in the midground. They're looking at the mossy boulders, the JCBs. Sorry, Joe. You will be looking for your foreground interest, your middle ground, your distance, and you'll be looking for things to connect those together. You'll be looking at mirroring the sky with the foreground and all these sort of connecting elements as you go into the foreground. And then you've got the other photographers who seem to have a different approach. And I think one of our audience members and speakers today, lost him, is one such. Now I know sometimes he gets a bit annoyed as being described as somebody who does sort of small, intimate landscapes, because David can do the big, wide landscapes as well as anybody. But I think most of us, certainly I do, recognise David as probably one of the finest intimate landscape photographers in the world. It's certainly those intimate landscapes of David's that drew me to his work when I was, well, tiny. And he'd been in that field for many, many decades at that time. But if you watch David going into the landscape, as I have done, he has that air of an elderly gentleman who seems to have lost his glasses. And
I always have.
Yeah. And rather than having that heroic gaze looking off into the distance, he seems to be sort of stumbling around in the foreground, looking around his feet. And he will spend a lot of time doing that. If you watch him, he will be mesmerised by the intimate, by the small, by what is going on around him. And it's quite a different approach to those that are looking at the wider landscape. And it's this concentration on the details that makes David so good at what he does, because what he then produces, which baffles and amazes me, is he'll suddenly find this frond of fern wrapped around a mossy log. And even if I'm stood next to him and I try to take a photograph of exactly the same frond of fern with that same mossy log, I still can't produce the amazing piece of work that he produces, even with his iPhone. He's frustratingly good at it. But what he's doing is abstracting from that wide landscape something small and intimate, something precious, something poetic, and something that has started to become something of detail taken from something much bigger. And it becomes less about the whole and much more about shape and colour and contrast and form. And it becomes less about what it is and more about something else. And we have a real connection with it. I'm sure if you look at David's work, you've had that kind of connection. And those things can be absolutely mesmerisingly beautiful. And sometimes it's a piece of rubbish that he photographs, an old forgotten fence in a desert that is rotting away, and yet with an understanding of colour and light and capturing just something that has been long forgotten, he can make something abstract and something that is really and truly beautiful, something that we would have hanging on our wall. Now you can then take that initial approach, quite a sort of just one approach into abstractness, and you can go even further, and you can look at Graham, who we've all come to see. I'm sorry, I don't know how that got in there. That's one of Graham's early school photographs. He's much more heroic and handsome now. But as we'll see when we go, I'm sure, and look at Graham's, I haven't seen Graham's exhibition, I don't know what images are in it, but what I'm expecting to see is something truly abstract, something that has even much less of a connection with reality compared to, say, David's work, where there is still more of a connection with the representational. Often in David's work we will recognise a frond of seaweed wrapped around a boulder on a beach or something like that. When we start to look at Graham's work, we lose all connection very often with what it actually was in the beginning. It becomes something which has lost all sense of scale. We have no idea very often what he's photographed unless he tells us and chooses to tell us. And it becomes something which is all about colour, all about shape, all about form, and it becomes a really masterful display of showing us something that the vast majority of mankind misses. Details, intimate details, often something in a tiny, tiny space that none of us would ever look at unless we had Graham's vision to take us there and to make us zoom in on that tiny, tiny thing and just see how extravagantly beautiful it is. And again, how lyrical it is, how poetical it is, because of the way he draws our attention to it. So there's harmony there, there's tension there, the colours are all working, and we feel a connection with it. Losing all the constraints that there are with representational photography, because once you go into the abstract, you're completely free of all the rules and all the things that we feel we have to do with representational photography. But the thing with the abstract photography is many people find it difficult. Once they start to look at abstracts, if it's not something they're used to, they either find it very difficult to make and they find it very difficult to look at. Some of us find it easier than others. Some don't understand it, they don't get what is going on. Some look at it and think, well, I could make that. The thing is they didn't, but they still feel that they could. Some think it's just a mess, and there's all sorts of things going on, and it's perhaps interesting to look at what is it about abstract photography that is so distracting. Why is it that some of us get pulled into this world of abstraction and find it so engaging and so mesmerising? Because if you look at literal photography, representational photography of the landscapes, which most of us do or have done to some extent, it's much easier for our audience to understand because it's what we see with our eyes. Our audience will look at photographs of the world around us, the landscape, the seascapes and so on, and immediately they've got familiarity. It doesn't take much interpretation. We're showing them the beauty of the world that they know exists. We might be showing them places they've never been. We might be showing it to them at times of day that they've never seen it before, in light they've never seen it before, in weather conditions they've never experienced. But they instantly get it. And so it's much easier for our audience to accept and understand. And also it's much easier for us as photographers, perhaps, to understand how to put the photograph together. Often the rules of photography that we're taught and explained to us, the rules of composition, and the whole approach to being in a landscape is much more familiar, and we feel much easier and at home with producing it because we're dealing with familiarity. And it's instantly beautiful, it's aesthetic to us as human beings, and we feel we can somehow compose an image and show it to the world. We know what we're doing with this kind of photograph. But once we start to move into abstraction, we start to ask maybe more from our audience, because the sort of hooks are not there. The things that we would naturally look for in art or photography are not going to be there for them to latch on to. And that's maybe why some never stray into making abstract images. And lots of people don't ever want to look at abstract images because it's not quite as easy to get into. So even with an image like this, which has got some elements in it which are familiar, there are leaves in it and so on, and so we can sort of get a feeling of what was going on when the image was made. There is still some abstraction in it, which makes it a little bit harder for us to understand, and there are fewer things for us to measure it against. Now, I found with my own work, I felt the need to move away from making representational classic landscape photography. And I think this quotation by a Japanese writer called Soetsu Yaganagi. This writer writes about the Japanese tradition of Wabi-sabi. Now, this is the concept of how things become more beautiful the older they get, the more they get worn, maybe even when they sustain damage. There is an aesthetic around that and a beauty in it, especially in things that are handmade or made of materials which degrade. So things made of paper, things made of leather, things made of cotton, things made of pottery and so on. So for example, there's a good example with maybe a pot that gets broken, and so they might repair it with gold and bring the pieces back together, and so the thing is enhanced and it's seen as more beautiful because of the wear that has gone into it. In other words, it's had a life, rather than the sort of throwaway society that we live in today, where if something doesn't look brand new, it gets thrown away and a new one is bought. And so there's a really nice aesthetic that goes with that. And what he said was, we in our own human imperfections are repelled by the perfect, since everything is apparent from the start and there is no suggestion of the infinite. And personally, that's what I found, that the perfection of representational landscape photography started to wear thin with me. I found it hard to be excited by everything being sharp, by everything being so perfect. I could still appreciate the great beauty of it, and I still do. I still love looking at beautiful landscape photography, but I longed for something more. I wanted my mind to be more stimulated for a longer period of time. I got the sort of calendar syndrome where, if you've got a beautiful calendar of landscape images, at the end of May, I was really looking forward to June's photograph. And I found that with sort of representational landscape photography. So, thinking about the difficulties of abstract images, there are very often none of the anchors that we're looking for. There are no trees, perhaps. There are no cottages. There's no line of fence posts. There's no curve in the river that we can latch onto. And so we've got to start working much harder ourselves. We've got to start thinking for ourselves as to what's going on. There may be some reality there, but we've got to start to think a bit more about it. We've got to start to tell our own story and decide for ourselves what's going on in the image. And so as the images become more abstract and the scale starts to disappear, all the questions we perhaps want to ask, we need to discard. So abstract photographers and artists, the questions they don't want to be asked really are, what is it? What did you take it of? How did you make it? So when you go into Graham's exhibition this afternoon, try not to ask those questions. Okay? Those kind of questions really should be irrelevant to us. It's a bit like, when Bob Dylan first came on the scene in the 60s, reporters were constantly asking, what do your lyrics mean? What do you mean by that? And Dylan just sat there and sort of shook his head at them. And he knew what the lyrics meant to him, but he wanted people to make up their own mind. What did the lyrics mean to you? And that's the kind of thing that abstract photography should be doing. It should be more about, how does it make you feel? What does it mean to you? What sort of emotions does it conjure up into you? What sort of memories does it bring back for you? And so think about those kind of things. Think about the image in a more emotional, a sort of visceral kind of way. And it will probably end up meaning something completely different to all of us as we go around Graham's exhibition. And it'll mean something quite different than it means and what it meant to Graham when he made the image. And that's what's supposed to happen. Quite different to representational photography. It's a much more right brain thing than a left brain thing. Forget all the technical stuff. Think about emotional, soulful stuff. So when the landscape photographer goes into the landscape and is thinking about the relationships between the sky and the foreground and all these kind of elements, what is the abstract photographer thinking about? What's going on in their minds? And if you're interested in moving into this kind of field, maybe how could you approach the landscape in a different way to have a go at this kind of thing? Well, maybe imagine yourself a layer down below that. And this maybe depends on what moves you as an individual. And we're all different in this. So, and also maybe it draws on maybe how romantic you are. And I mean romantic with a lowercase r, maybe not a capital R. Maybe think about the history of the place, what's gone on there in the past. Maybe think about the lives of the people who've lived there. Their history, their families, the toils and struggles they've had. If you're going onto a seascape, think about the eons of geology and the way the earth has been twisted and shaped and what has happened over the millennia there. Think about the gull that is flying over the water and how it must feel to be a gull flying over the waves. Think about being a wave. And think about a wave crashing on the foreshore. Is the wave happy to have reached the shore after coming across the Atlantic? Or is the wave dying when it reaches the shore? And is it the end of its life? Is it a melancholy thing? We can start to think in a completely different way about the landscape and then try and let that inform how you use your camera and how you start to portray the landscape. And you can use those same kind of thoughts to do representational photography. But you can really use those thoughts in an abstract way to capture the feelings within it. So I think Minor White's words, these are very well known, really capture this so well when he said, not only photograph things for what they are, but for what else they are. And I think that's what an abstract photographer is really doing, depicting the world for what else it is, rather than just for what we see with our eyes. That's the kind of thing that we're going for. So I feel much freer as an abstract photographer because I'm unshackled from the conventionality of realistic photography, representational photography. I've got complete freedom from rules. I don't care what anybody thinks about what I do. I don't have to worry about the rule of thirds. I don't have to worry about where my tripod is. I don't have to worry about hyperfocal focusing or micro distortion in the barrel distortion and micro contrast in the shadows or anything like that anymore. I don't care if I've got a rubbish lens on my camera, anything like that. It really doesn't matter anymore. It's wonderfully freeing. So I'd really urge you to have a go and find your own aesthetic. And something ironic in this is that a photographer that probably all of us whose work we love, no matter what kind of photography we like, one of the finest literal landscape photographers in the world, Ansel Adams, had a very inclusive attitude to photography and art. He did alter his pictures quite a bit in the darkroom, but he wrote this. He said, people are afraid to admit that they see something all on their own. So we need to return to the spirit of the madrigals, of the communal participation and joy of creating beauty in every form, to see each in our own way and be very happy in our accomplishment. So even though Ansel had his own style, his own way of portraying the landscape, and we love him for that, aren't we full of admiration for what he did? But he also had a very inclusive attitude to things like art and photography. And so he encouraged all of us just to find joy in what we do, whatever we choose, whether we choose to do representational photography, whether we choose to do abstract photography or a fusion of the two or a bit of both, whatever it is, the most important thing is that we get pleasure from what we do. And I think one of the great things about what's happening here this afternoon is that Joe and Joe have put on a display of abstract photography in a gallery that is known for some of the best landscape photography that's available in the country. And I think it's wonderful that you've opened the gallery up to do this. because it just shows that these things can live happily side by side, and that we can all enjoy all different types of genre of photography. So I think that's really commendable, and it's lovely that we can sort of expand our minds and be inclusive. It's not an either-or thing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what Graham's got on store for us. I'm not looking forward to the questions. Any questions? Oh, go on, David.
So let me start by declaring an interest. I like to use all of my brain, so left-right makes no sense to me at all. I think it's an old wives' tale. But if I've understood you correctly, you're posing a very sharp dichotomy between abstract and what you call representational. And you're posing the abstract as asking more questions of the viewer. But surely the challenge is, and the more interesting challenge, is to make photography of any kind that asks deep questions of the viewer, no matter what the nature of the photograph. So you can make a perfectly representational photograph that asks as many questions as an abstract, and possibly more, in fact. I didn't get any of that sense from your talk.
I agree with you. If I'd had more time, I would have expounded, yeah. I tried to say that, some of the things I said about looking down at the layers below and thinking, putting more emotion into photographs and things like that can be applied to landscape photography as well, because I do believe that you can make traditional classic landscape photography really compelling, and we do see examples of that all the time. I think sometimes it can become a bit sterile, and the concentration can become on the technical perfection.
But are you saying that doesn't apply to abstract photography? You don't see a bad abstract photograph?
Absolutely, yeah. There is, yeah. I agree, yeah. And I certainly don't. Yeah, I certainly don't hold myself up as a good abstract photographer either. Yeah. No, absolutely, yeah.
As a point that doesn't really carry any weight.
Yeah, sure.
And on the question of lenses, I don't give a stuff about my lenses as long as they
do the job.
I love to photograph in rain where it's covering the lens.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. I think that the opposition is not really tenable.
Okay. Thank you.
David had a question. I don't know if he's still there.
He's gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tim.
In terms of reading a picture, when you're looking at an abstract picture and you've got a representational picture, using dichotomy for a second, you can read a lot into what's there through the picture. There's a lot of abstract pictures. You think what's your idea about supporting narrative that goes alongside it? You said you can't ask how it was made or where it was made, but do you not want to communicate something in addition to just the picture itself in terms of some supporting narrative around it, like a project or some information about what your message may have been beyond the visual?
Okay, yeah, that's a huge question.
Yes.
That's a PhD question. Briefly.
Do you write stuff about your pictures for people to read as well?
Not often, no. If anything, I sometimes put a poem with it. But I've sort of moved away from titles even. And I sort of try not to. I try to let people make their own stories up. But I do work in projects. That's something I picked up from Valda, actually, of trying to put small collections together, maybe shot at a location, or a small collection that sort of hangs well together, rather than going for the single wow image or the single piece of work. That occasionally does happen, but more now I'm trying to work in small groups of images that work well together. For me, I really do want the audience to think about what they're seeing and decide for themselves. So I usually have got a strong idea in my head about what the pictures are all about, but I don't really want to impose that on the audience. So I'm really wanting them to think for themselves. With the sort of, even with some of the abstract work, I do some that is representation, or it might be windows on a wall, or trees in a woodland, or things like that, and you can clearly see what they are. And so obviously there is a clear direction as to what it is, and so that gives more direction to the audience. Some things are just squiggles and patches and colour, blocks of colour and things like that, and so then that could mean anything to anybody. I leave it that way.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
When you're creating your abstract photography, are you, you said obviously you have a narrative or an idea about what it means for you. Is that as you're taking the photograph, or does that evolve post photograph?
Good.
Is it a combination?
Good question. Yeah. Sometimes it happens on location, so I'll be thinking about what I'm seeing or what I'm feeling,
Yes.
what mood I'm in on that day, what's been going on in my life, or anything like that, and so it's informed by that. Sometimes it's when I'm processing, so the processing is a very sort of intuitive process, and it's a sort of a ramble of ideas, if you like. You start to see something happening on the screen, and the idea develops then from that. So it can work both ways.
Yes, no, it's interesting because I'm a painter, so I'm an abstract painter, so that's how I operate as
Yeah.
well. And I kind of, that's why I'm interested to hear about.
So you have.
Yeah.
So you start an image with an idea of what you're working towards,
But
or
I also allow it to happen.
yeah, exactly.
And then my interpretation.
Yeah.
So then, but in the same way, which is why I find this whole idea about your abstract interesting, is that you want it to be opened up to other people to create their own threads.
Yeah. So you understand the idea of letting people make their own minds up, and okay, brilliant.
And were these your own images?
Yes, they were. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's kind of you. Okay, better hand over. I've gone way over time.
No, that's fine. It's great. Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. I thought everybody was going to go for a toilet break, so I haven't quite set up. Give us one tick. I loved the talk by Doug. Give us a tick. Start that off. I'm not going to say that I use my brain quite as much as Doug, because I don't, to be honest. Flattered and delighted to be invited by Graham to give a talk at the start, alongside Doug, David, and Valda. And I see myself as quite a bit different, really, from them. One thing that Doug said about landscape photographers and whatever, I see myself more as an outdoor photographer. Discussion during the On Landscape conference at Reged recently, and when I interviewed Sandra, we were talking about things, and I realised I take photographs of anything if it's unlucky enough to come to my path, and I've got a camera in my hand. And really, I see myself as an outdoor photographer. For me, I wouldn't say that my brain doesn't get involved to a huge extent. Doug's thinking about the history and everything else that's going on. I tend to feel things more in respect of the moment, what happens, and it can be just about anything, to be perfectly honest. I mean, this is a fairly standard... Oh, bugger. This is a fairly... I mean, let's start off with this is, up at Benet, looking over a wee loch-in, and it's a sort of, remember the old Ingram's lakes and mountains, saga tours type thing. So it's a traditional landscape shot, but I love it, but it doesn't mean to say that I don't love other aspects of it. Is it representational, whatever? I don't really get into that side of things. At the end of the day, look at Graham, at Doug, Valda and David. They're creative, they see things that I don't see, that a lot of people don't see, that they're bringing something out of, they're bringing bits of magic and beauty out of nothing. And I can't do that. I see myself more as a reactive photographer. Again, I might be lucky that sometimes I've got a decent enough eye that I can perhaps see things, but my thing really with woodlands and with other things is, I suppose, seeing the bits that make us move, that make our heart beat faster, that we feel something for, whether it's more primordial, elemental, whatever else. But the thing that I like to think that I do is to perhaps, when Doug was talking about what we see into things, is I think as photographers sometimes we show people too much. We don't need to show everybody everything all the time. When we walk out into the outdoors, into the landscape, we'll see something that moves us. We'll see something that we think, bloody hell, that's nice. And I'm not a flat light photographer. I mean, all the images after the first one, they're all colour. None of them are natural colour, if you like. I don't really do natural. I have had enough of realism in my life for however many years. So if I play with colour a little bit, some people ask me, so what's your white balance set on? I haven't a bloody clue. It is what it is. I don't bother with menus and cameras. People going about, I don't like that camera system because the menu's complicated. I go into the menu once, I set the date and time, I set it to take raw, I set it to so that I'm in control, and that's pretty much it. All I'm after in the cameras is that it can take a picture. So, all these are split toned. In relation to split toning, it's just something to do. People ask about how to do it, and the best way I found to do split toning is to open something like a nice bottle of Malbec, put on some Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen's definitely better for split toning than the Ramones. The Ramones just too hard edged. But the whole point is you're kicking off your shoes, you're relaxing, and you're feeling things. Other people say that they don't process for a month or 2 months. When I go out and about, I'm not thinking about it. I get into the mood to get into what's happening, what's there, what's in front of me. Tim Parkin wanted to interview me years back. And I said, what do you want to interview me for? And he said, well, I just want to interview and find out what you're thinking when you're taking a picture. And I said, well, it'll be a bloody short interview because I don't think of anything. It really is. But so obviously when I'm processing, when I come home, I'm still in that mood, I'm still in that frame of mind. So I want to actually look at the picture when I can still remember what was I thinking when I took it. The thoughts, the mood, the emotion. What did I feel when I took that picture? It's a waste of time going back 2 months later because one of the comments Doug was making was about people looking at a picture and thinking what they thought. What were they thinking when they looked at it? And the thing is, I took the picture and I haven't a bloody clue what I was thinking when I took it. So it's because it's transient, it's fleeting, it goes in the moment. This is taken from the boat. For me sins, I'm retired, but I'm lucky enough to do a few bits of photography, and I work on the Ellsworth steamers. I've seen this little tree loads and loads of times, and it's just the way it's like a little wizened old man at the edge of the water. But I just love that little halo coming around, and it's just, you can see something thousands and thousands of times, but then on that thousandth time, it is just a thing of beauty. And that's the whole point about just being out and about. Light's the key for me as well. I mean, if it's, I said before, if it's flat light, I'm not one of these that wants to go out in flat light and they're going to look at the picture and they're going to put a bit of colour, or not colour, but dodge and burn and create pathways and stuff in. If it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. But the light makes a huge difference, that balance of light and dark. It's just about these wee moments. It's just about walking through somewhere and seeing something and thinking, one of the things that Doug was saying about, I sometimes think that the images like this, with the two trees there, sometimes I like to feel that it's more than the sum of its parts, if you like. There's something more there. There's a sense of the surreal, not maybe Tim Burton surreal, but there's that sort of thing. It really is just a case of, and all these are, Doug was saying before about, I think he made a comment about tripods or whatever else, but all these are handheld. The nature of seeing things quickly and suddenly is a case of it's on you and it's gone again in a minute. If you're standing there with a geared head and you're manual focusing and everything else, never mind, the moment passing, it's just about time for tea. But that's just, but exaggerate, I'm being sarcastic really, but it really is a case that it's quick, intense moments that just pass by in an instant and you're just struck by the beauty of them. This just struck me as it's a wraith, the tree that it wasn't there almost. So it's not a case of using tricks of light or anything else. Yep, I played about in split tone, and yep, as I say, that was probably a Rioja. But and one from this morning. These are all just side of the road shots in the main, or just when I'm walking it. Well, Not really when I'm walking the dogs. Harvey, my old dog, was great because he would sit still. I've now got 2 boxer dogs, which is 65 kilos of stupidness. And if you try and hand hold while at the same time holding 65 kilos of stupidness, then I'm going to end up with an image like dogs with a bit of wifty-wafty, because nothing's going to. But yeah, it's again, it doesn't need to be sharp for me. It just, you know, I'm looking at the trees at the front. It's just about the sense of the darkness and the silver birch coming through with the blizzards going through. So it's just really jump out the car, 200 mil, 2.8. I'm not bothered about a depth of field or anything else. It's just little moments, just transient things as the boat sails by. And it's not having a preconceived idea. You know, when you're talking about going out and shooting something and saying, right, I'm going to go to this point, I'm going to stand on that bit there, I'm going to look across there, I'm going to put that boulder there, I'm going to do whatever. This was at the end of a hair-raising drive to Inverness Airport, and this is the most mundane little bunch of mundane trees that you could imagine. But there was a real blizzard thrown through, it was plastering the trees white, and it was just a case of, you know, it's actually the driveway for the airport, so it was just dump the car on the side and a quick shot. And it's just, I think the idea, if you open up your mind to the fact that beauty really is all around us, and the trick is just seeing it. And that's the sort of way I approach the landscapes, if you like. I mean, these have all been trees, and it's all sort of hills. But it really is, they're all just little moments, but it doesn't need to be a preconceived idea what beauty is. Beauty is just whatever strikes you and makes you go, wow. You know, if you're walking out and you just don't get excited by changes in conditions or get moved by sitting with Julian Cal. I was in Harris yesterday, so it's been quite a long drive back and then a drive over this morning. But Julie and I were sharing the same thought that photography should be, or outdoor photography should be, a thrill-seeking adrenaline rush, because it should be. It should move your heart. It should excite you. If it doesn't excite you, then, to be honest, go fly fishing. But that's the thought. How do you expect to put emotion into an image if you don't feel any emotion when you're taking it, when you're out in the landscape? You've got to feel something. If you don't feel a connection with it, if you don't feel emotion, then that's not going to translate into your photography, in my opinion. Just a wee bit of birch. And so, I mean, more traditional landscape photography, but for me, I don't think about. It was funny when Tim, I think, when interviewed me, he says, "You don't use any foregrounds, do you?" And I thought, I don't know, I've never noticed. Never thought about it. Because I don't think about it. It's just, you know, I just see things like this with the Fairfield in the background. It's just 3 layers of colour. Simple as. Nothing else, nothing more. And it can just be, you know, lines, just walking up walking up Bonscale Pike, there's Restod in the background. And just catching the light with just the little bits of diagonals and lines. I like the lines. Or it could be, I read something somewhere. I don't read a lot in photography, to be perfectly honest. I know I surprised Joe when we were talking about photography. And in my first year, because I'm acutely aware of the fact that I've probably been doing photography quite a bit less than a lot of folk in the room. But I probably overtook them in my first year because I took 25,000 pictures in my first year. I didn't bother with a YouTube video, I didn't bother with a book, didn't bother reading or looking at anything else, to be honest. I went out, first year I took 25,000 images and decided, I was going to top up with water. I just decided what I liked, because to me it didn't matter. I couldn't really give a bugger what anybody else likes, because I'm taking the pictures for me. You've got to take the pictures for yourself to start with. You know, if you go out with Joe every day and you say, what would Joe Cornish do in this situation? All you're going to do is end up with mini clones of Joe. It's you know, when you go out, I always say to folk, you photograph what your heart tells you to photograph, but your head then gets involved and says, right, how am I going to do that? How am I going to compose that? How am I going to sort of bring out what it is that I can see that makes my heart move? And so it's your heart and your head both got to be involved. So I mean, somebody said, sorry, I'm going off on tangents because I do. Somebody said that, you know, you can't just photograph light. Well, it's just a picture of light. It's the base of Stop Derg, and I just love the light coming up through Glenetive. So, picture of light, nothing else. You know, just shapes, lines, a wee bit abstract again. As Doug was saying before, you know, I mean, one thing, if you just go to the top of a hill and you put an 18mm lens on and you take a photograph, everybody can see everything, so there's nothing of interest, you know, it's like, you know, move along, because you've shown everybody everything. What you're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do, is just take little bits and get your imagination involved, look at it and think, what's outside the edges, what's beyond those boundaries, what's across here, what's up there, what's down there. Get you thinking about what it is, you know, and just the transient nature of the landscape, and just trying to capture it in these wee moments. I mean, I can't understand how wet it must have been that day, because we were through there, Rachel and I, the other day, and that stream wasn't even there, and it was absolutely been pouring down for hours and hours and hours. But little bits of light, so I mean, usually for me it's a long lens, because with a long lens you really can pick out those little bits of landscape, and you really can hide what's off the edges, what's above, what's below. And just get, you know, it's all about imagination. You know, I mean, ambiguity of scale, I think, is a great thing in the landscape. Even, you know, doing representational stuff. This is High Cup Nick, which is an amazing feature in Cumbria. It's about 2 miles in. Impossible to photograph. You try and photograph it and show a sense of scale, you're just going to left with a tiny, tiny little bit of the landscape, and you're just not going to feel anything from it. So in those sort of circumstances, I tend to photograph just a bit of it, try and work in a sense of, well, try and remove a sense of scale and just keep the viewer guessing. Ambiguity of scale is just such a great thing in photography, just for getting people wondering. I mean, that's across a little bit of Glacier. I can't remember exactly. Waste of time saying I can't remember where it is, because I wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway, to be perfectly honest. Harris last week. I mean, sometimes you do think, you know, a little bit more. And it is, I mean, I think of titles sometimes when I take the photograph, and it was like In the Darkness We Live, because it was just the darkness surrounded by light, and it's just a wee section. There's a bit in the road through to Hushnish where you've got the Eagle Observatory. If you go to Harris and you want to find an eagle, don't go to the Eagle Observatory. Because there's a breeding pair down there, they're very territorial, they spend a lot of time in a nest, so there's about one place you don't see the eagles, because they chase off all the other eagles. I think we saw about 13 eagles when we were there, and we saw none. But getting back to it, it's just, you know, in the darkness we live. Just the darkness surrounded by light just drew me in. And that's pretty much my photography, is just seeing little bits that appeal to me. I don't really think about, would it appeal to somebody else, would it appeal to Joe, would it appeal to Graham, would it appeal to Doug or Valder. It's whatever appeals to you, it's what moves you, it's what moves your heart, it's how much you want to show. If you want to show everything, it's a record of where you've been, what you've done, that's great. I would never, ever choose to change people's style or focus. Same with a tripod. If some people like to use a tripod because it slows them down, it makes them connect more with the landscape, they might have a busy working life. I'm lucky in that I don't have a busy working life, so I'm pretty chilled-ish most of the time. And I feel fairly connected to the landscape a lot of the time. But it is all about enjoyment. When the light's nice, this is me, pretty much. Although I'm probably not as organised as him. But that's the key. That's the thing. You've got to be excited. You've got to love it. You've got to be able to go out. Like Red doesn't give a bugger what anybody else thinks of him, what he does, and how he goes about it. And that, for me, is the approach to take when you're photographing. Whichever way you photograph is, you photograph for yourself. You photograph the things that you love, that make you excited, not what David Ward loves or whatever else. You photograph what moves you, what brings joy to your heart, basically. And by photographing that way you bring atmosphere, emotion, whatever into your images. People ask about sense of style. If you use that approach and photograph what brings joy to you, then you'll build up your own style anyway, because you're creating your own, well, you're not creating, but you're just being you. You're being, everybody's unique. We all see exactly the same thing with totally different eyes. And the secret is just to follow what you do. And that's pretty much it. I have no idea how much time I've used. moves to a very good own brand Malbec, which is quite nice.
Yes. It talks about capturing things in the moment.
Yep.
When you're there. Do you ever go back to images you've captured and see something different after a period of time? Or are you always kind of drawn back to the original reason you took the picture in the first place?
It's interesting because obviously you're in a different mood. You know, if you run by emotions, then yeah, it's quite often I've looked at something afterwards, and usually in the processing, because a big bit of what I do is in the processing. You know, when you split tone, and I am, I'm not a faithful servant of the truth. I am moving things around. So sometimes I will go back and I'll look at an image and I think, I mean, if I go back. As soon as I saw that, I thought black and white, primordial. It was like a far more malevolent, menacing sort of thing. It was like the trees were munching rabbits, basically. It was like, ants, whatever. And then I looked at it a while later on and I thought, I've lost the organic sort of nature of the trees. So I went back and processed it again, but looking at the roots and everything else to make them more living and less, I suppose less malevolent, but more, well, just more organic. So yeah, it quite often I look at something and just a different mindset.
Any other questions?
Good.
No, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Absolutely.
Hi there. Okay, those of you who know me know how hard I find this and how bad I am at it. I wish I could be like Mark, who just seems to be able to open his mouth and out it all comes, all making perfect sense. Instead, I will mumble and stumble my way through, probably not making any sense at all. Should have my top on it back to front. That's not a good start. Anyway, having said that, it's a great honour to be asked to talk, albeit briefly, alongside people whose work I admire so much. I must offer up thanks to Joe and Graham for giving me this opportunity to share a few ideas. One more thing, this goes out before the watershed. There may be a profanity or two. Not my words, I hasten to add, but to dilute them would rather detract from the anecdote with which they're associated. More of that later. I'm going to talk about abstraction, and I'm afraid there's a little bit of crossover with what Doug said, possibly understandably because we teach together. We talk about abstraction a lot. We talk about it with the people that we're teaching, and I guess almost inevitably we're going to cover some of the same issues, so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I'm going to talk about abstraction and some of the issues that it throws up for an image maker and why I find it so compelling. I kicked off with a group of images I saw recently at the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, recently, partly because they were so dramatic in their unapologetic blueness, and partly because I'm a big fan of Cy Twombly. Even his name is an abstract jumble of letters. It's so cool. It can't even be an anagram because there's not enough vowels in there. And of course, this isn't so much about me, rather a celebration of the work of the incredibly talented Mr. Cook. He uses vibrance and movement so exuberantly, and his joy and celebration of colour shines through his every image. He's a master of tension, balance and subtle nuance, what J. Mazel called the elusive gestural quality that makes an image sing. His innovative abstractions evoke a sense of time and timelessness. They're never laboured, and they appear to all the world to have just suddenly appeared with little effort, seemingly little effort, I'm sure. I know that's not actually the case. His work has many fine qualities, but for me, the one element that makes it so extraordinary is his eye for colour and composition. Okay, there's two things. As far as I can remember, the first time I met Graham was on an Impressions of London workshop that Doug and I were running for Light and Land. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And I knew immediately that other than basic camera settings for multiple exposure, which is what we were teaching, there really was going to be very little I could teach him. It was just immediately apparent that, he was the real deal. And I remain humbled that he continues to come on our workshops, and I'm lucky to be able to call him a friend. His work and his thinking continued to have a great influence on my own. Like many photographers, when I first started making images, I was doing little more than holding up a Xerox copier to the world. As time went on, this approach became more and more unsatisfying, and I started to cast around for something else, A new direction eventually emerged. My interest now lies primarily in abstraction. Great joy is to be had lost in a world of shape, pattern, colour, texture, rhythm, light, etc. And when freed from the constraints of conventional landscape photography, one is able to let the imagination roam. However, such freedom needs boundaries, and this is where some of the many difficulties begin. Those with more mainstream objectives know how their histogram must be. They know that the sky must be blue and the grass must be green, there or thereabouts. They know about the rule of thirds and the holy grail that is the hour before sunset. Dare I say it, they also know about their JCBs. Sorry, I've repeated Doug there. So, where are the guidelines for the abstract artist? Who tells us what's right and what's wrong? We're not depicting reality, then what exactly are we saying? Is it interpretation, emotion, nothing more than empty-headed doodling? With the freedom that we have to deliver such radical interpretation and tortured truths, where are our rules? Where do our parameters lie, if indeed they exist at all? Lumping our work under the banner of interpretation can cover a multitude of sins. If I describe an elephant, I might say it's a creature with big ears and a trunk. So here's an interpretation of a creature with big ears and a trunk. So I first delivered that gag on my first ever camera club talk, goodness knows how long ago. Then, as now, I must credit my late brother, who used it in his introductory philosophy lectures to his first year students. And it's not entirely inappropriate for the issues I'm talking about today. If we meander and ramble our way along our creative path, freed from the constraints that the more conventional photographers have to guide them, how do we find our way? Creativity thrives on boundaries. We all know that. And so without the enslavement of the histogram, harnessing so many reckless tweaks in Lightroom, we need to find a place to draw the line. Everything is open to interpretation after all, and therein lies great freedom. John Paul Sartre talks about man being condemned to freedom, so yes, the difficulties are very real indeed. And stepping into this ineffable, unfettered wilderness is really about trusting intuition and trying to quell the rising tide of doubt and inner criticism. I think we all know that, and that's no small undertaking. However, as hard as it is to reconcile these convoluted imponderables, I think such issues pale into insignificance when set against that other charge levelled at art, and perhaps specifically abstract art. What does it mean? Perhaps it's ill-considered even to broach such a subject in the space of 10 or 15 minutes. It can surely only be a matter of time before the abstract artists find themselves face to face with that inscrutable conundrum that is meaning, clarification, justification, intention. Perhaps in a way that might not necessarily have occurred to them, or certainly to me, when pitching a camera in front of Durdle Law. And therein lies a veritable hole of paradoxes, ambiguity, contradictions, etc., I have discovered. Attempting to unravel such mysteries will eat up as much time as you care to throw at it, with no end of a resolution in sight. We exist in a vast and turbulent universe, so for me, abstraction is a way to create a little bit of order within a frame from the unpredictability that surrounds us, loosely speaking. That sounds a bit paradoxical, given that much abstraction is inherently chaotic. But is that enough? Is it a valid explanation? Formalism has long since fallen out of favour, but I have enough self-knowledge to realise that I tend towards aesthetics and emotion, rather than intellectual significance. However, as theoretically driven conceptual work is undoubtedly the prevailing direction of the art world today, it certainly warrants further investigation. Is that what we should be striving for? A couple of paragraphs of impenetrable arty bollocks? And that's a sweeping generalisation, I realise that, but it's hard not to have our judgment coloured by the vast number of unpersuasive statements of intent propping up lame artwork. And of course, it hardly needs pointing out that one person's arty bollocks is the next person's succinct and considered elucidation. I know where I draw the line, but even so, that line wavers and shifts as time goes on. I'll just read this quote. Without a descriptive caption to justify its existence, it will speak for itself. Sorry, it's really small. Less descriptive, more creative, less informative, more suggestive, less prose, more poetry. In What to Listen to in Music, Aaron Copland considers whether music has meaning. My answer to that, he maintains, would be yes. Can you state in so many words what that meaning is? My answer to that would be no. There are surely elements in art that cannot be expressed in words, and I sometimes find it futile even to try to verbalise what it is I'm trying to say. So to delve a little bit deeper, cognitivism in respect to the arts suggests that in addition to their aesthetic value, they also carry a significant cognitive value. Considered and valid arguments can be made for both sides of the coin. The anti-cognitivist argues that to ascribe this value to a work of art, artists will be at best hopelessly jockeying for position alongside scientists and philosophers. I know my art isn't political, I happily leave that to others, but does it have any meaning? It does to me, I suppose, but even then I can't say I'm plumbing great philosophical depths, certainly not by comparison. Well, does that matter? Well, perhaps it does. I can certainly see why this image benefits enormously from knowing what underpins the series. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Chris's story. This is one of a set of images he made after his 16-year-old son lost his battle with depression and took his own life. Graham has written at length about his work, and I look forward very much to reading his insights. Similarly, with work coming out from Doug following his illness last year, their images will certainly be given added intensity by knowing what lies behind them. Chris's images and those of Simon Ashmore, who recently lost a child also, certainly acquire an added dimension when one knows their story. There are many others I could name, and I think it's fair to say that of the many people whose work I admire, most write elegantly about their images. So clearly for me there's no definitive answer here. My brother was a philosopher with a brain the size of a small planet, and I'm now starting to understand why he was the way he was. His head was so full of so many imponderables, there was no room in it for the practical stuff. I suppose I think of art primarily as an aesthetic pursuit, and I find it quite difficult instead to consider it primarily a cognitive pursuit. Perhaps for me the truth lies in some sort of halfway house. More reading needs to be done, more chewing it over with like-minded, equally confused souls over a bottle or two of red. I suppose I rest my case somewhere between mindless doodling and incomprehensible, for me, intellectualism. What I do find hard to embrace is the fact that the emphasis on intellectualism in the arts has meant that the value of craft is marginalised, if not now entirely absent, in many areas. And as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, we've all seen far too many mediocre images being propped up by shallow or impenetrable statements of intent. I wish I had a way to wrap this up with a neat and justifiable conclusion. So perhaps I will leave the last word to John Lennon. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room who spent their teenage years lost in the lyrics of David Bowie, or say the words of T.S. Eliot, trying to unravel them, trying to make them make sense for me. John Lennon was characteristically disdainful when people tried to analyse his work. When he discovered that students at his old high school were being made to analyse Beatles lyrics, he found the notion so utterly preposterous that students of literature should be pontificating on the symbolism of Lennon and McCartney. He responded by writing, "I am the walrus." Yellow matter custard, semolina pilchard, improbably scaling the Eiffel Tower. And he flippantly remarked, "Let the fuckers work that one out." Perhaps the real answer is not trying to get inside the head of the artist or the songwriter or the poet in order to find meaning, but instead delve inside one's own. Maybe by overly dissecting a work of art, it can detract from the ability of the art to convey a sense of heart-stopping beauty or grace or harmony or any other number of qualities. The sense of being overwhelmed by its very presence, for example. I acknowledge that this is a treacherous path to even attempt to traverse, especially in the space of 15 minutes. I'm a doer, a creator. I leave the convoluted reasoning to academics. That's way above my pay grade. But as one travels further along this path, there are questions that pop up unbidden and at increasingly regular intervals. The answer is, of course, reading and education. The problem, as ever, is time, and not enough of it. And so perhaps the only conclusion that it's possible to reach in such a short space of time is to shoot from the heart and interpret it how you will. And with that in mind, here are 4 images I made while in Bilbao recently with Doug and our respective spouses. We were doing a guided tour of a winery for a recce for a subsequent workshop, and obviously it's hard not to get carried away. So here is my ode to Bacchus. I'm not sure at this stage whether it will develop into anything or whether it's little more than an idle doodle. But it's certainly a subject that's close to my heart and unfortunately my liver. And that's it, folks. Obviously no questions.
Right there. That was fantastic, Valda. Anybody got any questions for Valda? That was a bit of a tour de force. It's given us a huge amount to chew on. So hopefully people will ask you later if they have
That's okay.
questions. Great, thanks. Valda Bailey, everyone. It's nice to be back in the UK. I don't have to worry about elephants behind bushes and things like that anymore for a while, so that's nice. I'm struck by the people who come before, how actually everybody said that we do very different things, but actually there is a very common thread to creativity and emotion and how we work through the process. Valda and Mark, who have very different styles of photography, they still have the same core values, I think, which is about expressing themselves and only thinking actually about themselves when they make a picture. And the talk I'm going to do today, I think, is going to touch upon some of that. So it's called Point of Stillness, and it really refers to my passion for the still image, but there are lots of things that go around that. Lots of photographers these days seem to feel that they need to be videographers as well as photographers, and I think it's hard enough to be a photographer, especially if I can't find my glasses, as Doug pointed out, you know. And I don't feel the need to develop another skill as well. Photography allows us to arrest the passage of time. That's kind of the key thing. Most people make photographs as memories. They want to take a picture of their loved ones, or whether that's red, or whether it's your other half, or whatever it is. And that is what has always attracted me, that ability to arrest the passage of time. The stilling of light and form is just a fantastic thing to me. Now, in reality, this piece of dancing ice, an hour later, had gone. It had melted and it had fallen away. But for me, it's now forever preserved in that form of the photograph. The world is in constant flux, and I suppose that's one of the things that appeals to videographers. Things are always on the move, and the rate of movement varies enormously. You know, it's either too fast to see, the hummingbird's wings, or it's too slow to see, the mountain building in the Karakoram. And there's only actually quite a small zone in the middle, which is open to us. But photography stretches that zone, and I think that introduces a magic to the images that result from it. So when we sample the river of time with a photograph, moments which are inaccessible in the flow become possibly, hopefully, frozen gems that can be studied at our leisure. You know, one would love to say forever, but I guess it's until the hard drive dies. We can expand that split second of the hummingbird's wings, or we can collapse seconds of water in motion into a gossamer film. We have access to areas that before photography were literally as remote as the surface of Jupiter, if Jupiter even has a surface. And that's an amazing thing in itself, really. Hopefully it's going to change. The art of photography, and this is something that I think everybody has pretty much touched on, but not in these words. John Sarkowski observed that it's essentially the process of quoting out of context. So you place a frame around a portion of reality, and by doing that, you change how people view that portion of reality. I can remember reading that, 25, 30 years ago now, and thinking, how come that wasn't obvious to me beforehand? You know, it's one of those fantastically pithy little lines that you realise changes your whole view. The photograph, of course, is removed from all sensory context, not just what's outside the frame. You can't smell a photograph, you can't feel the cold in a photograph, you can't hear the ocean, which is 20 metres away from where this picture was taken. So you have that ability through that process of stilling the world to change how people view the world. So the process of stripping away context produces a distillate, and the concentration of both form and mind are called for. You need to really concentrate. Extraneous detail must be excluded. What's left out is every much as important as what's included. Now that whole process is time consuming. Hunkering down in the dunes as a gale force wind whipped past me and the camera, and trying to make sure that the camera wasn't going to shake too much, because unlike you, Doug, I care about that. An hour seemed to go in the blink of an eye. You know, I think everybody who's ever made a photograph is aware of this way that time becomes elastic. It stretches in different directions. You know, you miss the fact that you're soaking wet and you're cold because your whole being is concentrated on making the photograph. We become unaware of clock time, which is, you know, it's an artificial manifestation in itself. And we become entirely immersed in subjective time. And that's where we should be at this point. Making a still image involves solving a multi-dimensional puzzle. Lots of people talk about composition, the dreaded rule of thirds, and we all know what the acronym for that is, ROT. Has become such a dominant thing through, I think, mostly through the internet, but it was, to be fair, around in camera club discussions before that. I don't think rules have anything to do with composition. Composition is solving that, as I said, a multi-dimensional puzzle. There's light, there's time, there's colour, there's tonality, and at the same time as you're doing all of that, you're also transforming space, because you're collapsing it from 3/4 dimensions to 2, and you're also kind of trying to orientate it so it sits nicely. So that's about what lens you choose. It's about a whole load of decisions. And that sounds complicated, doesn't it? When you put it like that, you know, it's a lot easier when somebody says, "Oh, you just use the rule of thirds, or you use the phi." You know, that's brilliant. You don't have to worry about anything. And I'm sure all of you up until this point thought that all you had to do was turn the dial to P and press the shutter. I mean, that's it, isn't it? That's you don't have to do anything else. Such working out how you are going to solve that puzzle requires our undivided attention. Yet, when we're in the groove, in the zone, on a roll, on fire, in tune or in the flow, it seems easy. It seems completely effortless. Now, the concept of flow was first proposed by this man. I am not going to try and pronounce his name. He's a Hungarian psychology professor. Yeah. Thank you, KK. And he said that flow is being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement and thought flows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Now, I think that very neatly sums up exactly what Mark said. When he's out there, he's not thinking about it. He's being reactive, but his reactions are the result of his life experience. They're the result of how he feels about the world. And I think that's how it ought to be. So in this state, we get carried along by the task in hand. You know, it's as if we've been caught in a powerful current in a river. We're just going with it. And the vector of our journey, where we end up, should be determined by the demands of the undertaking and not by self-reflective thought. So if you think too much about whatever rule you want to apply to the composition, you are going to end up with something that is likely to be wooden, mannered, maybe forced. In flow, there's often a feeling of brilliant clarity, in which the craft associated with making the photograph seems to seamlessly blend with, in photography's case, your compositional choices. There is always, I think, to some extent, a dichotomy, in that some of the things to do with working a camera require language. So they require part of your conscious brain to set parameters. They require you to say, okay, I'm going to do this at f14 because that's the, unless you do Mark's thing and you just set it on RAW and go, which is probably a good way of actually getting past that. There are 3 preconditions for entering flow. Firstly, the activity must have a clear goal, e.g. solving the puzzle of composition for us as photographers and making a personally satisfying photograph. It's not about the place, it's about that task. The task must have clear and immediate feedback. Oh, how I wish that was so with a 5.4 when you waited 2 weeks for the film to come out from the processor. The digital age is so much easier. So success or failure should be readily apparent. And of course with a digital camera you can just look at the histogram on the back, you can check that your composition's right. Oh no, I need to take that again because I've included Auntie Ethel's finger in the left ankle. All of that stuff can be fixed. We need to know that the things have been satisfactorily resolved in short order. Now, if that's the case, how did we as dinosaurs cope? Well, we developed a foolproof method, so we didn't worry about those things. So the craft barrier was higher, wasn't it? And I think that's why there's been a flowering of photography, because at least that step has been brought down. What hasn't changed is that you still have to make those creative leaps. And that is the difference between a good photograph and a bad photograph. I mean, art is all relative and not absolute, there is no such thing. But it's about actually knowing how to progress that process rather than how to make a perfectly exposed picture. Because again, I think it was Mark who said that if you've got somebody talked about taking an 18mm lens up a hill. Was that you or was it Doug? I can't remember. And you get everything in. Yeah. That leaves no room for the viewer. So it's a pointless exercise. The third thing is there must be a balance between one's perceived skills and the difficulty of the task. E.g., you don't feel totally out of your depth. Now, the great thing about that as part of flow is it actually leads us to exploring the boundaries of our abilities, to pushing against it the whole time. So over time, it's like a ratchet. You get better and better because you get a satisfaction from having completed it, and each time you get a little closer to the edge. So flow, because of that ratchet, results in better performance, whatever that means in terms of art, through that feedback loop. So it's quite difficult to read at the back, so I'm going to read this out. Very rarely are we able to free our minds of thoughts and emotions and just see for the simple pleasure of seeing. That's Bill Brandt. I think that's the key, just to see, just to be when you're out somewhere. Flow is an innately positive experience. That Hungarian guy, whose name I'm not going to pronounce, said it produces intense feelings of enjoyment, sometimes even rapture. To a spectator, the person in flow might appear to be lost. They might appear to be wandering around and looking at the ground, as Doug said of me. But that's not how it is to the person who's in flow. For them, they are more intensely here, probably, than they are at any other point in their lives. Now, I think flow has really helped me personally, and there was some mention actually already with Valda and Doug about problems with mental health. Now, I was clinically depressed a few years ago, really in a pretty bad place. Making photographs became my haven from the storms that threatened basically to drown me. It was the way that I got through it. Over time other things change as well, but being in the flow and being in that place where all those contradictions disappeared was a fantastic thing for me. And the joy that we experience in flow means that we crave further experiences that are going to give that. So, as I'm sure the partner or spouse of any photographer knows, photography is addictive, and that is now official. Not that our partners ever doubted that. Pursuing something that invokes flow is not just about searching for a temporary high. It seems that it gives us long-term health benefits and overall leads to higher levels of happiness. So that's all good stuff. It also depletes your bank account quite severely, but which is the one downside really. So Bill Brandt again, the photographer must have and keep in him some of the receptiveness of the child who looks at the world for the first time, or a traveller who enters a strange country. I think that's the best gift any of us could give to ourselves. That's just fantastic, to have that childlike joy and innocence. I think that my best photographs are visual contemplations kind of wrapped in stillness. I try to make them have the ability to focus our attention upon the walked upon, the passed by, and very possibly the overlooked. This is next to a rather famous wreck in Saltwick Bay. Which bizarrely, I didn't realise that the boat was called the Admiral von Tromp. Yeah. Hopefully they will enable us to see beauty in the decrepit and the mundane, and that is what I'm searching for the whole time. I think there's beauty is everywhere, and it's not that anodyne quality of a beauty contest. It's about something deeper than that. I found this quote by Leonardo: "Learn how to see, realise that everything connects to everything else." And I love it, but I do wonder if it's a bit like the quote from Abraham Lincoln that he doesn't believe anything he reads on the internet. So in flow you enter a hyper-receptive state. You can start to stare at things till they start to come apart. You know, like if you look at a word long enough and you think, no, it can't possibly be spelled like that. That can't be true. So it allows us to, for me, flow allows me to step outside the cacophony of everyday life and to move into quietude. You might say that, for me again, or I might say, that stillness breeds stillness. It allowed me to see these grasses. You know, this is passed by. It's on a path at the back of Culmore, and because I was in that receptive state, I noticed the way the grass was kind of draped across the stone. This is a place called Amroth in Pembrokeshire, because I'm sure it's key to all of you to know where it is. and here it was about the pebbles that I suppose have been imprisoned by the raging sea, you know, the force of the waves. Or simple weathered geometry in Cornwall. or a shape that appears when the wind blows. So those are all things that I don't think I would have been aware of if I'd not been in that receptive state. One final thought from Bill Brandt. Most of us look at a thing and believe we have seen it, yet what we see is often only what our prejudices tell us to expect, or what our past experience tells us should be seen, or what our desire wants to see. For me, only in stillness do I truly see. That's it, folks. Questions? No, they're all blown. Oh, come on, KK, you've got to have a question.
I think a common theme of the talks has been the privileging of emotion, the personal, the ego, and so on, over the intellect. Do you really believe that? Does anybody really believe that? It seems to me that the intellect is an incredible achievement of humankind, and we can do both. It's not one or the other, it's both.
Well, no, I don't believe for humankind as a whole that we should.
For photographers as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a mixture. There's a mixture, but I think for me, at the point of creativity, I'm not making much in the way of conscious decisions anyway. What my subconscious is doing is an entirely different matter, and I firmly believe there's a huge amount of subconscious processing going on.
To you that without a vast amount of work before you went out there, you wouldn't be able to achieve the images that are free flowing.
Yeah, well,
free flowing because you worked a lot. Worked at it very hard. To give you why I'm stressing this is, as a mathematician, I will work incredibly hard achieving nothing for a very long time, and then over a few days, there it is.
Yeah.
But it would be false of me to say it was just
those few days.
Even my emotions. No, it was not. It was all that hard work that prepared it.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a positive service to photographers who are trying to learn that to achieve some level of good photography. That if they go away believing, I just need to express myself. My question to that is always, what's so interesting about yourself that you want to see it expressed?
Well, not everybody has anything particularly interesting, no. I think you're obviously right that the back. No, let me finish. The background to the process. So everything that's led up to the point at which you take a photograph, in some way, has some tiny part to play in the making of that photograph. So, I've read quite a lot of art history. I've read quite a lot of philosophy. I've even read something about mathematics, but it was 40 years ago. But all of that, which I know, all of that plays some part. Yeah. But I think if you, for me anyway, if I try to overthink in a conscious way at the point at which I'm making the photographs, that they don't work. Maybe that's a failure of my ability to think in that way. I don't know.
Well, that's not the point I'm making, really. I mean, whether you consciously know that you're thinking about it, I put it to you that actually all the reading, all the hard work you put into it, are absolutely crucial to your success. That's a compliment. Enjoy it.
Thanks, KK.
Any other questions?
Pam has a question.
Could you put the quote back up about seeing like a child?
No. Yes.
Because that for me is what it's all about.
But a child who's read a lot, obviously.
That's exactly my point.
Tim has a question. Is it? Could I do that all again, but without stumbling? Is that your question, Tim?
Figure out let's bring a bit of intellectualism into it. I read recently there is a branch of tries to study why people find things beautiful and interesting and why they like art.
Mm.
So one of the big findings was that people enjoyed art when they felt as if they solved something,
Mm.
had a puzzle solved, or they've discovered something in the processing of a picture. And that may not happen when you've got representational straight landscape photography, but very much in your photography that's true. And is it also true for a lot of abstract painting and photography as well?
I think I think puzzle solving is a big driver in life as a whole, whether you're a mathematician or whatever you do. I think they've done some functional MRI scans of people who are doing things like crossword puzzles or Sudoku or whatever, and you know, the pleasure centers in your brain basically light up when you solve it. And I think that's what led me to this notion that composition is actually solving a puzzle, and that the high you get is having made that resolution, is having. Now the difficulty is with art that there is no single solution. There's no correct solution. So the solution is personal to you, based upon everything you've read and learnt, and but it still doesn't mean that you can't derive a great feeling of satisfaction from that. And I think that is right. So whether somebody likes Doug or Valda's work or something more representational or something somewhere in between maybe, would largely be to do with their personal life experience, and whether they feel prepared or interested or intrigued by something that's a little bit more challenging. The way that I always kind of think about this is that for me a great piece of art is something that leaves room for the viewer to interpret, to bring their own story to it. And so if something is too baldly representational, it doesn't leave any room. It's just describes something. It doesn't give you anywhere to go after that. And all these things are always on a spectrum, aren't they? You know, at one pole you've got people who only ever see things for what they are, and at the other pole you've got people who see things for what they might be. And we're somewhere on that spectrum, wherever we fall as individuals. You know, I'm guessing that. Well, Graham actually must find it quite difficult to navigate the world, because not just after the Malbec, but you know.
That's why I don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Any more?
Do you have any exercises you do to kind of get yourself in the zone, get yourself in the flow, besides the bottom now?
Yeah, I don't drink generally. No. Well, I do drink, but not when I'm taking photographs. I don't specifically. No. I think it's just settling down. I quite often find when I go on a trip that it takes me a day or two before I can make anything that I think is at all worthwhile, because I need to get into the right headspace, and I couldn't describe to you how I do that exactly. It's kind of I suppose because over the years, you know, I've run I don't know what 180, 200 tours or something, workshops now. I know that when I go on one, that it's going to be my safe space for making photographs. So my brain is sort of, oh yeah, okay, you can start doing that now. Whereas when I'm at home, it's like, yeah, well, I've got the gas bill to think about, and then there's lunch, and yeah, so I find it very difficult to just pop out and make a picture. I find it, in fact, almost impossible to do that. Whereas Mark, I know, when he's on the boat, he's doing a similar thing. You see he's posted 27 pictures from one morning, and you think, how the hell did he? If I make that in a month, I'd be doing well. You know, so we're all different in the way that works. I think if you go and look up about flow, there are some exercises that are posited for getting you in there, but I think it would be an individual place to be. Any others?
David Ward, thank you very much. No, it's a special occasion for all of us. We're all
we're all very excited to be here. But what I'd like to do this afternoon, before we go and see the show, is talk a little bit about your creative process. And I think that everybody here, almost everybody, knows you personally. So some of you may already know the answer to some of these questions. But whatever you're prepared to reveal, at least in public, about your creative process.
Yeah, it could be difficult.
Well, we'll see how it goes. Let's just kick it off. Now, I think that most of you are probably on Landscape subscribers. I was going to say survivors there for a minute. and that as subscribers, you'll probably have seen that there was a wonderful interview with Graham a couple of weeks ago, which I think Tim did, or Charlotte did. Michaela did.
Michaela.
I'm so sorry, Michaela. Fantastic. Brilliant interview. And the very first kind of major answer focused on somebody I'd not chatted to you about before, which was your father.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, from your description, he sounded like Superman.
Yeah, he was Superman. But then everybody's father's Superman. But my dad was really Superman.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the very fact that he could suspend himself from his toes off
Yeah.
a branch of a tree.
It was embarrassing. He even tried. I mean, he carried on doing it even when he couldn't do it. So he ended up. He has this terrible neck problem after a while. And it's, but he was a lovely man, and he was a very imaginative man. And the stories, the things that I've mentioned in the feature were. They're all true, and there's lots more of them. So this whole notion of shooting off to the coast, he used to fiddle around with the shortwave radios and hear where there were police incidents, and we'd go out and look at a fire or a car crash, or we'd go down and I'd sit on and he had a Royal Enfield motorbike with a Watsonian sidecar.
Right.
So I'd sit in the back in the sidecar until I was big enough to hold on to the back on the pillion of the motorbike, and then I'd hold on to his belt. He used to wear a big grey Macintosh and big gauntlets, and we go down there in the pouring rain, and I'd be hanging on to his belt at the back, talk about health and safety. But it was a wonderful experience because we go to Seaford, where there's a seawall that goes out, and you can walk under through it, and the waves hit the other side of it, and it crashes against it, and it's quite terrifying in a big storm. But for a 7, 8, 9-year-old, it was just wonderful. And he was he's a big man, my size. So he was quite something, and he was into everything, and his little shed was full of stuff. Mending watches and glass engraving and all sorts of things. And you'd pop down there and he'd be listening to the Billy Cotton Band show or whatever, Round the Horn on a Sunday lunchtime. And you'd pop down and say lunch was ready, and he'd have one of those little eyeglasses in, that pushes the eyelid up. Yeah. And he'd be looking at a watch and he'd look up at you, and this great myopic, this thing looking at you. Okay, Gray. Yeah, okay, lunch, I'm coming. And he put all his tools. And it was just full of cobwebs and full of crap, really, but it was wonderful crap.
Fix anything, and a real craftsman polymath.
Yes, he could. Yeah, Well, I could bore you with stories of cars breaking down on the Honiton bypass, and by the time the AA turned up, with all this long before the main roads were put in, there was just traffic everywhere, and he'd be in there solving the problem. By the time the AA arrived, it was already done, and he'd blown out the problem with the oil filter. He'd got this sort of this black mark round his mouth, and he was chatting away then. It was like his big lips moving. I was dying at the age where you die with embarrassment when your father's sort of talking and you can see something's wrong and he can't see it himself. But great influence, just tremendous.
That sounds like a very inspiring kind of primary influence. It gave you a lot of freedom of approach to life in general.
Yeah, very much so. I think he encouraged me to think variously, just to think differently, and he would try to do things that made me think differently. If I was working on something, if I was doing a drawing, he would come along and he would play around with the perspective of it, and it would force me to find another solution to what I was drawing or what I was trying to construct. So. And all the toys that I had, I mean, they were made by my father or my grandfather. So I'd have like a farm unit, but it was all made and it was all painted lovely, and it was just like a properly manufactured toy. But they did all that sort of stuff. And just a lovely environment. And there were things like swords and old gas masks, and as I said, mentioned bits of Second World War aircraft. I mean, he lived not far from Biggin Hill, so the whole Battle of Britain thing was going on.
There's a slightly scary little anecdote about him shaving off bits of bombs and throwing them in.
Well, he had several incendiary bombs, and in fact, he was my grandfather was he was chauffeur for a guy called Lord Mayorstein, and so they were relatively privileged living on this lovely estate. They lived in the lodge, and that lodge now is under the M25. Unfortunately, but also as a pile of incendiary bombs, according to my father. So they were buried there. But he kept some of them, and yeah, he used to. At bonfire night were wonderful. He used to shave bits off and throw it on, and with these sparks and things happening. And, it was just quite something. It's just what you'd expect, isn't it, as a kid? You know, all this stuff. But he'd give me. I mean, I get a thick ear if I was late back for lunch on Sunday.
Yeah.
So I was controlling.
But you weren't an academic at school, were you? But you
absolutely not. No, perish the thought.
But you came to your own when you went to art college.
Yes, absolutely. I think. I mean, I tried hard at school, but I was always just elsewhere, and I think that just applies with the way I approach my creativity. It's just my imagination gets in the way of being an intellectual. I don't have any problem with that. I mean, I try as hard as I can, but it just doesn't happen easily. But at art college, I was able to be the person I thought I was meant to be. And of course, then when you leave and you go into a commercial environment, you have to recalibrate that. I fortunately was in a creative environment. I remained in that for 45 years and was relatively successful at it. But it did stop me being freely creative. And so that freedom has only happened when I bailed out of running a business and the worries about staff and wages and all of that. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating, and I always think, looking at your work, to recall that you're also a renowned painter, and that your painting is actually quite representational. And a lot of it is portraiture. I don't know if you do any other, but that's the work that we see of yours. And it's to me, a fascinating kind of contrast that in your painterly world, you're representational, but when you pick the camera up, you become an abstract artist.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be an abstract painter, but I've found abstraction through the camera, and I don't know how that's happened, but I've found where I want to be behind a camera. My default position is to be very realistic in the way I've always been able to draw very photographically, and I can't break away from that. These two know that from our painting group. Very talented. We're all very talented there. But they know. I mean, they know the problem I have, and I wrestle with trying to be freer. And I start off with the notion of being very free in interpreting, and I end up something that's pretty representative by the end of it. If I spend too long at it, then I'm creating a photograph primarily. But the face is like a landscape. That's why I do so much portraiture. I mean, look at Dave Mead. Look at this. That is one hell of a landscape. But there's so much to see. And there was a comment earlier about how things were when things kind of get older and they get a few more wrinkles, and there's much more character. Not you, Dave, this time. But like David Ward, for example. But there's a lot more, and trying to capture the personality as well of the individual. And I love that. It's a very immersive process. I enjoy it immensely, and I get lost, completely lost. Time just doesn't exist when I paint. But it has a battle with photography. But photography is giving me it's giving me an answer to a thing that I want to do, and I can't square the circle on it at the moment. But I'm happy being where I am. And I know Deborah and I have chatted long about the problem I have with should I major on one or the other, and we reached a conclusion the other day that look, I'll do abstract photography and I'll do realistic painting. Why not? Why should I be in such a bad mental space about it? Why should I try and change? I do both of them relatively well, so why do I try and beat myself up over it?
My goodness.
Thank you.
He does, yes.
Do you ever have misgivings about that? That's an interesting comment, because what you do, I think absolutely everybody here would probably agree with me to say that what you do is absolutely amazing and unique. And it's not that we wouldn't want you to change, but that your journey as an artist with a camera gives joy to almost everyone who's got an open mind, who enjoys abstraction, who can appreciate it, and I'm sure there's so much more still to explore.
Yes, I think I think there is. I think I do wrestle with where I might end up, though. I mean, coming back to that point, I do enjoy painting probably more than photography, if I'm being honest.
Sorry.
I feel more complete. I'm more into the whole process.
Yeah.
You know, this mark making, this thousands of marks you make of applying marks and taking marks away. And even though my work looks relatively realistic, there's a huge amount of abstraction going on within that because of the way I've placed the paint on the canvas. And I lose myself for a lot longer. But that's not to say that I'm not happy with where I am with my photography. I mean, look, you know, what's going on this weekend and this today. But yeah, I think I'm probably more comfortable behind a canvas than a camera.
Right.
Sorry, Jan.
No, it's not a competition at all. So long as you continue.
Well, you mentioned to me some time ago, because I always used to preface when we showed work on workshops, I used to say, well, look, this is what I really am, a painter. And I'd show pictures of my paint. And then we go into the photography, and you end up by saying, well, I think you're a much better photographer than you are a painter.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not.
With respect, I think you added that on the end of it as well.
Maybe a more imaginative photographer, but that may be, I mean, I think you're a wonderful painter, don't get me wrong.
Well,
can we talk a bit about printing? Because I think for a show like this, you have to work long and hard to bring those images to life on paper in the printing process.
Yes.
Do you enjoy it?
Yes, I do. I think it is part and parcel of the. If you don't end up with the final print, that is the essence of what you of showing what you started out to record. I think it's a waste of time, quite honestly. I don't want to pass it over to somebody else in order to do it. I want to have control over the entire process. It's like putting all this together and putting the book together. I've done virtually just everything on it, and I want that control. And the printing is an integral part of it. I don't necessarily say I find it easy, and I don't certainly. I mean, I've done some printing courses with you, and I still don't work in the way that you've taught me to work. I still work in my own way. You know, I've got the videos and I can see how I should be doing it, but I end up putting that to one side and going back to.
I hope I've always said that there's no should.
Well, of course you have, yeah, and that's one of the most rewarding things of the workshops that we do with particularly with David and Joe, is that there's the evening session with the processing sessions, where you can learn so much about how you can reinvigorate images, and you can make sort of minor adjustments and just little subtle touches. That's been really eye-opening to me. Very, very rewarding. And this is something from somebody that's not particularly technical, as you know. I don't know what's in my camera bag.
I just want to ask you about which f-stop you used on your lens.
I think it's permanently stuck on about F11.
Yeah, so long as it's stuck there, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's. I think that it just seems so. I mean, we know you use a phone. You probably use a camera, and most of the time you probably handhold. Occasionally you may use a tripod. Does it matter? Any of that?
Well, it doesn't matter. I just use whatever is necessary to do the job. I'm not particularly worried what's in my hand. I mean, it's just a medium, isn't it? As Paul Kenny, I think, said in his talk. It's just, I'm just working the medium to create. Much the stuff that I create because I think of it as painting. I imagine it on the wall of, heaven forbid, sorry, Piers, Tate Modern. But I see them as paint, and perhaps that's what I'm doing with photography. I'm trying to paint. I'm trying to create paintings, trying to create painted art. I don't see those images as photographs.
And
Scarily.
actually, yeah, no, I totally get that. I think that's one of the most powerful things about them, because they transition between the world of fine arts and photography.
Mm.
For me, my response to them is that they're exciting because they're made in the real world. They're more exciting because of that.
Yeah.
If they were pure mark making for its own sake, then they'd still be brilliant. But the fact that they come from the world out there elevates them to another level, because they represent the world of the imagination in reality. And the fact that you are able, through this extraordinary ability to see that you have, to bring that to life. And it's an inspiration for the rest of us in that way. So
right.
I hope
we'll end it there, shall we?
One more question though, and that concerns 20th century abstraction in particular, which is an area that I'm really interested in, painting. And I kind of see, and indeed beyond, because you can also see the influence, I would say, of Turner and Monet in your work, and, but especially mid-20th century abstraction, which is, I did a fine art degree, so I'm at least reasonably familiar with the kind of energy and culture of that. And your work seems to flow out of that. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think.
And if not, what the difference is?
Well, I think so. I think my interest in art probably starts with Constable and Turner and Palmer, as you very because he painted locally. So there's a great resonance there, and runs right through to probably the 70s, 80s. I love the futurists. I love Nevinson, Wyndham Lewis. You know, I just the constructivists. Some of the Italian artists, Marinetti, people like Balla. I love the way they try and interpret the modern world. They're battling with trying to interpret it. It wasn't there before, and they fight that notion and try and deal with it. And that, those things are great. The great influence of when I don't go consciously with those images in mind when I rock up to Dungeness or Hastings or wherever it might be, and start scratching around. But clearly, as was pointed out earlier, the whole thing that comes out is the sum total of my life, really, and the things that I have. I may not be aware of the things that have influenced me, but they clearly do pour out. And I've always had this. The thing I find hardest to control is my imagination, and it's irreverent, as you know. but in an environment where I really can be myself, then it's hard to control. But it's one of the biggest assets I have. I'm able to see things and see beyond what they are, and I love them, as you pointed out. I love the marks that appear on objects that are a kind of hieroglyph. They're a notation of the life of that object, what it did before, and as those marks might be added to what that might be in the future, what that object could become. If it was a surfboard, for example, I wouldn't just photograph the surfboard. I'd photograph the story that's in the scratches on that surfboard, and I'd be thinking what those scratches can become beyond the surfboard. And that's what excites me. I mean, I don't really care if anyone likes it. I like it, and I don't care. Maybe there's not a huge intellectual thing underpinning it, but there clearly is, because it's everything that I've reacted to in my life. It comes through and comes out, and but I kind of know it's right. I don't know how this happens, but I sort of know when an image is right. It just turns around, looks at me, and says, Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll go with that. So.
I think it's a brilliant explanation of the creative process, and also it elucidates it in the way that you naturally see your work as a reflection of who you are.
Yeah.
And everything that you've experienced.
Yes.
And that it emerges. And I wonder how many people are lucky enough to be able to do that. So I hope you know that you're a very, very lucky man.
Well, yes.
In all the right ways.
Well, I'm lucky enough to be here, and I'm very fortunate that you mentioned some 18 months ago that the gallery might like to carry my work. But obviously I had to convince Joe, because it's not your decision.
Absolutely right.
So I had to truck all the way up here with my work and hope that it would be liked. And as we've already been pointed out, this is not necessarily a happy home for abstraction. But as it's proved, it is. And I'm thrilled, flattered beyond belief that all you guys have turned up. And there's good reason for it, because there's some lovely speakers here, but they're all people that have influenced me immensely. David Ward and Joe particularly, but I mean David Ward is the guy that has made a massive difference to the way I think and look at the world, and everyone else has just added momentum to that. The theatre, the drama, the sheer vivacity of the Whiskey King here, and you know your encouragement, and Doug and Valda's, you know, their desire to pursue the paths they're on. I think it's lovely, and it's just a broad church, you know. There's such wonderful work out there, whether it's the representative side of the spectrum or it's the more micro.
Yeah, I just don't see a schism at all. I think there's a continuum, and
absolutely,
each informs the other.
Yeah.
I think it was Ansel Adams who said that that your work is a reflection of every book you have read, every film you have seen, every song you have sung, every dance you have made, every person you have loved. You know, and I think that is truly reflected in your images.
I mean, my influences have been Eden Bright and Richmond Crompton. That sort of so there's nothing deep in my images at all, and it's usually in big type as well. So.
Well, before we finish, has anyone got any questions for Graham?
Great. Oh, I knew you would have.
It's a simple one. How long have you actually been taking photographs?
Well, I suppose an honest answer to that is all my life, because at art college with my Yashica mat, believe it or not.
Lovely twin lens.
Yes, yeah. A little bit of trouble with the close-up lenses on them because of is it parallax or something?
Yeah, parallax.
That's it. That's as much of my technical knowledge that I. But I mean, not seriously. I've always taken holiday snaps and things inventively, and they're not just typical holiday snaps. But I've never really had the time to go into it to the level that I am now, and that's only happened in the last 5 years. So what you see really is just a resume of 5 years' work. After that little cathartic moment in Cadgwith, in December 2013.
On that workshop where the very first morning, what happened?
Oh, my new Canon 5D Mark III with heavy camera with a very pathetic tripod on slippery rocks. And I turned to get a filter. Yes, sorry, filter, in those days. And I looked back and there was no camera. And then I looked over the rocks and there it was, clicking away furiously. So fortunately I had a 7D with me, and Pat sorted out my insurance very, very quickly. I had the money in the bank before I got back home, so that was so that paid the tax. I had a tax bill as well, so that covered that. No, that was, and it was that picture was taken with the 7D, because obviously it was the day after.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but made all the difference. And I had the courage to show it that week, because I was so nervous in the company of these wonderful photographers that I refused to show my prints. In fact, Mr. Ward had to come up to my room. And then we looked at the prints. Yes, he did. Yeah, well, one of them. that was it.
Great stuff. Anyone else? Yes. Warren.
My question is based around my experience I had with you a couple of years ago.
Really?
I remember
I'm fully recovered.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, Graham and I were on a course with Doug and Mark, and we pulled up at this beautiful location in a minibus, and it was a tarn, and there was the sunset and the hills and everything. It was beautiful, and we all sort of stormed off to the water, set up our tripods and do our bit in the honeypot location. And I remember turning to Doug and I said, "Where's Graham? Graham's disappeared." And Doug said, "I think he's got his head stuck over a rusty car bonnet or something back in the car park." So my question is, you were stuck back in the car park. There was a rusty old car there that was derelict, probably there for 20 years, and you were there on your own with your iPhone, and you'd seen something. You didn't need to rush off with the rest of us.
No.
You were on your own and you saw that old car that probably no one's ever looked at, but you saw something there. What attracts you to those? To those materials, to that.
Because I think it has. I think for me it has more. It has more questions to answer. There's more things in it that require solving. It also has a. It has a commentary about where it is in the landscape and what's happened to it in the landscape. So even if you're just taking a little bit of the shadow or a scratch on it or whatever it might be, it's probably it's informed by where it is in the landscape. So I think there is a relevance to it, and I just find more mileage in that kind of challenge. Rather than, I find it hard to do what Mark does. I do conventional landscape photography, if you want to call it that, because sometimes I'm emotionally moved to do it. But as a rule, I probably would prefer to go and delve into.
So in a funny sort of way, you wish something could speak to you and tell you history. So I think something has to speak to me anyway. Otherwise, and there's got to be more of me in the picture. If I'm solving the issue with a puzzle of something not terribly attractive in front of me, and I'm trying to find an attraction in it. I'm working hard at that. And there's more. If I get something out of that, there's more of me in the shot, and I'm happier that there's more of me in the image, rather than rocking up, tripod, boom, exposure, filter, nice shot, but how much of me is in that shot? And can sometimes that be just a very small patch on a piece?
Yeah, I mean, we went to Reactive a couple of years ago, and we were all having a cup of tea after shooting the set pointing mountain near the buckle. Thing. And lots of people were shooting that and the water under the bridge and things. And we had a cup of tea afterwards, and everyone was showing their iPhone pictures or their Canon pictures, and you said, "Where's Graham?" And I came wandering out this little copse, I suppose, and showed you this picture. Scotch bonnet, it's called in the book. And I'd found an old car crashed in the, and it had buckled the bonnet up, but it was reflecting the trees. You can just about see them. So for me, that was interpreting Reactive. It was my experience of being in Reactive and picking up the landscape of Reactive. And it I don't know what that. I can't answer that deeply. I mean, it was there. I wanted to do it. I felt I wanted to do it, and when I did it, I knew why I wanted it, because it worked.
One of the great things that I perceive in having watched you work is that nothing is out of bounds for you.
No, nothing at all.
It might be the back of an Armco barrier
Yeah.
beside the road when
Yeah.
everybody else
Yes.
is photographing the waterfall.
Yeah.
Or it might even be the toilet door in the gallery.
That went down well, the toilet door in the gallery. It was necessary to be in the toilet, I have to say, but I took longer over being in the toilet than I would normally do. And that was when I showed... that's after I showed you the work. And I was just killing a bit of time before I had to go and get my train. And I just noticed, I think you've had mice or something, but they'd scratched the corner of the door. and I just saw a moonscape. You know, there's the cliffs, sea. It was your toilet door.
And in actual fact, I can certainly see in your images, and maybe I shouldn't do, but for me, most of them are landscapes.
Yes, they are.
They just happen to be landscapes of the imagination, rather than of the obvious world.
Yeah, there are two impressions of landscapes in there that are a bulldozer, in fact. But they're wonderful landscapes.
Anyone else got a
So
question?
I'm not saying anything else about the images because they are
okay.
they're secrets.
Understood. Anyone else? Tim?
Even though you appreciate and like a lot of modern work, 1970s, you still go out into the landscape and you're obviously quite emotional about it. I think a lot of your work is still earthed in romanticism.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I'm a very emotional person, and this is very emotional. And I thought I wouldn't be able to talk about my dad without a few tears. So yes, I'm really moved by conditions in the landscape and by being there. And a lot of the time when, I'm going to Snowdonia with David in a couple of weeks' time for some R&R, I hope, after all of this. And I'm just going to enjoy being in the landscape. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to absorb it. And if anything comes out of it, it will do. But it's just enjoying that space and that place. It has every opportunity anybody could ever want to be a creative artist.
I think it's worth saying before we finish that your book is available for sale, or have you sold out already?
Oh, heavens. No.
Okay.
No, there are a few copies downstairs, yeah. There's a lot of people here that owe me money.
We're locking the doors.
I don't like the commercial side of this at all, but there's a list of people that need to come forward with some folding, and there are those that have already paid, and but I've got a little box of I don't know, 12 copies left, I think. There's been a little rush this morning, so I'm quite pleased with that. Ching.
Good stuff.
No, it's there if anybody wants it.
Fantastic. Well, I think before we do, I think we are up for time, aren't we? Before we go in and enjoy our private view together, which will be in 2 rooms, and I think drinks are going to be served, Joe, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Jolly good. I just wanted to say, and I'm sure I'm reflecting what everybody else here feels, that you have been an inspiration to us all in various ways, different ways perhaps, and it's just been fabulous having you here. Really looking forward to the rest of the evening. So Graham, thank you very much for coming.